I think that as an engineering manager, there comes a point after a few years where you need to decide whether you're going to go back to engineering or you're going to climb the ladder.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode in our series about engineering leadership. My name is Rob Osell, filling in still for Tracy Lee. Today, I'm here with Charity Majors, the CTO at Honeycomb. Charity, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. We are here at reInvent, so everything's a little mad, but this is why I have this lovely, for those of you on video, I have this lovely suite at the wind behind me.
Yeah, it's very impressive.
It's larger than my house in San Francisco. It's a little ridiculous.
Well, that's great. Well, for people that aren't familiar with you, you are the CTO at Honeycomb. I was wondering if you could kind of
Hmm.
introduce yourself a little bit and explain a little bit about how that came to be of becoming the CTO at
Yeah,
Honeycomb.
totally. Um, so my name is Charity, as you said, and I self-identify as an operations engineer still. Um, I have had a career of being an infrastructure engineer. My sweet spot has always been I like to be the first infrastructure engineer that joins a bunch of software engineers at a startup, and as soon as they have real customers, they're like, "Oops, how do we make all this stuff actual instead of just like running off of our laptops?" I really enjoy that. I was doing that at Parse several years ago. We got acquired by Facebook, and out of that experience, my co-founder Christine and I founded Honeycomb. We're kind of the first actual observability company. For several years there, we were the only observability company, and then around 2020, everybody else decided that they do observability too. So that's cool. Um, I am very much an accidental CTO, accidental founder. It was never on my roadmap or my list of things to do with my life. But here I am. I started the company and 100% thought we were going to fail. I was just like, well, I've never had a pedigree before. Now, suddenly coming out of Facebook, I suddenly have this pedigree. So I felt kind of obligated on behalf of all women, queers, dropouts everywhere to take the money and run. And here we are 8 years later, and we seem not to be failing anytime soon. So that's good.
Well, that's wonderful. I know that we've both been around in tech long enough to remember that there was just sort of this idea that when you were in tech, you were an engineer and then a senior
Yeah,
engineer and an architect and then a manager. And that was just the progression. That was what you had to do to keep developing your skills and keep advancing. Today,
yeah,
that's not a thing at all, but it's a tough or that doesn't have to be the case at all, but it's a tough transition to go from being an engineer to being a manager. And obviously, you going through it without necessarily that being the goal, as you said, sort of
yeah.
being a little bit of an accident. I was wondering if you kind of explain a little bit about that process and its ups and downs for you.
Yeah, I've been in management a couple of times, and it was never, I never know whether to believe people. When I ask them why they get into management, they always say these lovely things like, "Oh, I just love supporting other people," and "Oh, I just love, mentoring and, seeing an impact." And I got into management for none of those reasons. I got into management because I was sick and tired of being left out of decisions. I wanted a seat at the table. I wanted a say in what was happening, and evidently, the only way that you did that was you became a manager. Of course, after becoming a manager, I realized I hate managers who are managing who are managing for those reasons because I don't like being told what to do. So the last thing I wanted to do was tell other people what to do, right? I think it's really exciting actually that over the last, half a decade or so, this emergence of staff engineering and principal engineering has really kind of become something real. There are books now about it. This parallel path that you can, your career can develop without you having to be a manager. But I do think it's super interesting because so many things have changed over the past 5 or 6, 7 years. When I wrote the first piece I ever wrote about management was the engineer manager pendulum, and I feel like I spent most of the past 7 years arguing managers out of being managers and telling them that they should be engineers because I feel like we had so many unhappy managers and so many people who were
Hmm.
didn't really want to be managing, became managers for the wrong reasons, weren't happy, um, and I spent a lot of time telling them you can be an engineer, you can have power, you can have respect, you can be in the room where decisions are being made. I think all of these true things have become very true. But we're kind of left with the question of why then should anyone be a manager?
Yeah, it really is interesting question, isn't it? Because we're in this era, I think, of just employment and work in general, where people are kind of looking at a set of responsibilities and saying, why would I take that on for, take on that extra responsibility if I'm not getting commensurately rewarded? And we can talk about whether people are or aren't, but there really is this sort of questioning of just taking on responsibility as a sign of achievement by itself. And that might be also contributing to this idea of people looking at being manager and saying, that's a lot of work. why would I,
It's a
why would I
lot
want
of
to do that?
it's a lot of emotional labor, and I think that the pandemic was kind of a tipping point. Plus I think that just, our expectations of managers have been rising over the years. People used to just complain, "Oh, my boss sucks," but it was just kind of expected that they told you what to do. And we've slowly been realizing that, this isn't for, touchy-feely reasons. It's just that that's how bad decisions get made. It's when people who are out of touch with the technology make the
Mhm.
decisions, right? Technical decisions need to be owned and driven by technical people. And even organizational decisions, if you don't have buy-in, if you don't have, it just doesn't lead to a healthy organization if you just got people bossing people around and letting arrogant assholes run rampant. Our expectations of our managers are much higher than they used to be, which means it's a much harder job, and people beat up on managers a lot more than they used to. Frankly.
So it's interesting. So if that's the case, what is a reason why someone would want to be a manager then? Because I think there are, as you said, some of the things that you went into it for are true and are important. So I guess, there are, I think, things that need to be maybe re-advertised for people on the
Yeah,
sales pitch for
exactly.
kind of being willing to go onto this track.
I think that number one, engineering managers are good ones are transformative. They Companies run so much better when they prioritize management, engineering management in particular, and when they make sure people, are held to high standards, that they're given training, that I mean, a team with a good engineering manager is just, runs circles around a team without one, or a team with a bad manager. So it really is an important job. It really matters. It needs to be done, and it needs to be done by people who care, right? Not people who are in it just for the power, or just as a ladder. Um, I also I think that, you and I were chatting about this a little bit earlier, but I think it's a little bit like parenting in that it's a hard job. You shouldn't go into it thinking that it's going to be fun all the time. It isn't.
Yeah.
But it does matter. I think a lot of us care about doing things that matter. What is it Dan Pink says that, research shows that all of us, what we want out of our work is autonomy, mastery, and purpose, right?
Mm.
And where, at the end of the day, a lot of the features that we write are going to get, deprecated, or nobody's going to use them. You can't argue that what managers do doesn't matter. Like, there's a strong sense of purpose there, even if you don't necessarily get recognized as easily as, it's easy to clap for someone who built a feature, who got, or who like recovered the site when it's down or whatever. But it's a manager's job to kind of not put the spotlight on themselves. But if you do, get this deep intrinsic sense of having done something that matters. And I think your impact as an engineering manager can extend beyond the boundaries of your team. It's not just about the people who report to you. Part of the job of engineering management is building the social part of the socio-technical systems. If you manage to improve the job ladder, or the hiring rubric, or the interview process, or recruit some historically marginalized groups, or make the workplace safer for them, or the ripple effects of that labor last for generations in terms of work. People might be getting equitable pay 20 years from now because you fixed something right here and now. I mean, it's huge. It's a lot of impact.
Yeah, it really is true. I'm struggling to put words to the feeling that I have hearing that, because what I'm what jumps to mind is this idea that if you worked in a system where, as an engineer, where you're just getting tickets and just a ticket comes in and you don't care, it just has a this is what's expected, and then you just did that. And you did that, and that was your career, and you enjoyed coding and you were fulfilled. Then all of a sudden you work in an environment where you have autonomy, where you get to help
Yeah,
decide what the features are to work or how to implement them. It's really hard to go back to the
yeah,
ticket system where you lose
yeah.
that autonomy. And I think that that's kind of that promise of management to some extent. It's not just autonomy, but it is harder if you give it time for your brain to kind of upscale to that broader set of more abstract challenges, to then let that be a black box again and be content. Like that's that pendulum thing. I think that's what swings people back into it, is once you go back out of it, that's a hard thing to kick after you've really
Yeah.
gotten attuned to it, is losing that being touching everything and then having to kind of be on the outside
Well,
again. That is a tough feel.
that and for those of us who are kind of like information gluttons, like I do think of managers as being the nervous system of companies because, it doesn't scale for every node to talk to every other node. You have to have some sort of routing system. And the engineering manager is like, you're the router, right? You make sure that people, and I think it's really unhealthy when engineering managers use that as currency. Instead, you should be thinking, instead of thinking about who to give what information to, it's like, instead of like what you're giving them, it's like what do they need, and then you make sure they get it instead of sometimes people kind of get that backwards, and I think it's really toxic. But yeah, being on the inside than being on the outside. But I do think that like the fastest way to coin a good staff engineer is often to take a good senior engineer and put them in management for 2 or 3 years, because so
Hmm.
much of being a good staff plus manager is that being attuned to the business, being attuned to the socio-technical systems, as well as having that depth in the software. I don't know.
Wonderful.
A lot of people are pretty happy to put it down, but I think that there's so much value in having engineers who used to be managers on the team. Oh my god, I love having those engineers on my teams because they have credibility with the other engineers, right? There are things that managers can tell the team, and engineers might go, "What?" But if the engineer who used to be a manager is on the team, they're often to be able to be like the truly sober voice in the room. Like one of the hardest parts of management is when you have to tell your team something that they're not going to like, and you can't tell them why, because for ethical reasons, for privacy reasons, for some reason, that if they knew what you knew, they would understand, but you're not allowed to tell them what you know. And those are the moments where you really, really love having ex-managers around.
This program is presented by This.Labs, the framework agnostic consulting firm helping enterprises realize their technical goals through staff augmentation, consulting, project management, on demand subject experts, training, and other professional services. Find out more at This.Labs.com.
Well, you wrote about this recently, or recently, I guess in the last year or so, about this idea of these different types of managers and their responsibility, and how some managers really have this opinion that their role begins and ends with their people, and then
Yeah,
you introduce other responsibilities for managers, and one could imagine that there are types of managers who are only focused on those things. But I think this challenge that you're saying of having to disappoint people really sometimes comes when a manager does have to put these different goals that they have, that these different things they're maximizing, and play them against each other, right? As architects, as
yeah,
engineers, we're so familiar with talking in trade-offs, but as managers, they hit so differently because they affect people and the company
yeah,
in pretty profound ways.
yeah. That's super true. Like, and I think that like for so many of the managers who are kind of like the current generation of new managers, a lot of them got into management because they had bad managers and they were just like, I can do so much better than this. Right. And they have this checklist of things that they're never gonna do. And they don't do those
Going back to
things, right?
parenting, right? There's a lot of parents that say,
Exactly.
I'm just not going to do what my parents did." Exactly.
So true. So true. And for a lot of new managers, this comes out, they're super empathetic. They leave space for their team's feelings. They affirm them, they support them in taking, paid time off and mental health days and all this stuff. But like that doesn't make you a great manager. That alone does not make you a great manager. Uh, so much of your responsibility as a manager is not directly to your reports. I mean, yes, it's very important that you're, nurturing them and helping them grow. And sometimes, by the way, nurturing them and helping them grow does not mean feel very nurturing. It feels like you're pushing the baby bird out of the nest. You're challenging them. But it also involves, just like your top responsibility is never to an individual, it's to the team, and sometimes this means being you have to be hard on the individual. It's also your ultimate responsibility is not to your team, it's to the company, it's to the organization. And there was this team at Facebook where the manager, every single time that there was review season, he gave everyone on his team exceeds expectations, just across the board. And that was a huge problem. People loved being on his team, but it was a huge problem because it wasn't fair to anyone else in the organization. And, I don't know what the ultimate outcome was there. I just remember hearing the directors just like talking about what to do. And I realized that up to that point, I had often been the type of manager who really optimized for what was best for my team. I would angle for them to get this promotion or angle for them to get this and that. And it was very uncomfortable for me to realize that actually I was part of the problem.
It is so difficult. I think when people hear that, managers and even directors and executives hear this, um, you don't want that to have to be true. You don't want to not be able to go to that furthest extent. I know sometimes when I've talked to reports, it's been like, I will give you the highest rating that I can credibly give, but you're going to have to
Yeah,
help me make a credible argument for it. Uh,
yeah,
and yeah, that is, that's challenging. But I think, like, again, these are skills that engineers aren't learning. So there's that fragile
yeah,
moment when you make that transition from engineer to manager, when you really feel like you're just kind of a failure because everything
yeah,
that you're doing is hard and unnatural for you,
yeah.
and you have to think about a lot of it. You're in your head a lot. So, like, what are we supporting managers in this phase enough? Is there more that we need to be doing, or is this just the natural process of that? Like, is this causing people to be afraid of this? Is there something that we should
I
be
mean,
doing to make that easier for them?
yes and yes. I think we could definitely be supporting engineering managers more. And yes, it's always going to be super uncomfortable. Um, the reason that I think we should be doing more management training is less, I don't know how much less uncomfortable we can honestly make it for individual managers. But the reason that I think that companies should do more manager training in general is to have consistency between their managers, so that it doesn't feel like you're working at a completely different company depending on what manager you happen to report to. I just think that there's no wrong answer, but there should be one answer when it comes to a lot of organizations. Um, but that's really hard. I actually just finished. I've been working on a leadership lab for the past 6 months at Honeycomb, and it's hard. Needs to be done, but it's pretty hard. But it, it is dizzying, and I feel like the best way that I've tried to explain it to people is like you can know all these things in your head about what managers are supposed to do and what how they're supposed to act and how they're supposed to think, but like it's like you have to give your body the chance to learn all these things too, because your instincts, your intuition, your how at the end of the day whether or not you did good work that day. Like you've just spent what 5-10 years as an engineer learning whether or not to trust your judgment or when to trust your judgment, and you're going to have to give it a few years as a manager to learn that as well. And it's rough, but on the bright side, like in the way that your engineering skills do degrade over time, your language skills in particular do degrade over time. The skills that you learn as a manager don't. Like if you spend 2 or 3 years as an engineering manager, you'll take those skills with you throughout your life, and not just at work. Um, if you spend time learning to give people feedback, which really just means like getting better at first being aware of what you're thinking and feeling, and then articulating it in a way that is helpful to people. That's a skill that most of us need at home too. Learning to find that line between confrontational and just like not speaking up about our feelings is like one that very few of us have mastered, and having to work on that skill every single day at work has the potential to make you a better human.
I wonder too your thoughts on one of the things that I think people do when they first become managers, or they don't do rather, is like change up their social dynamic. And what I mean by
Oh
that
my
is like
God.
they follow the same people on Twitter, which means that as a manager from an engineer, they're just reading about the coolest new tech and the people working on the coolest new tech. And they're not necessarily going out and finding other people that are engineering managers like themselves, or people that they aspire to become on the leadership side of things.
Yeah.
And I think that just breeds unhappiness, because you're
Oh
not
God,
seeing any
yeah.
reflections of success. And I'm curious your thoughts on like how people should be looking to find other support structures as they make this transition.
If you're an engineering manager, you absolutely owe it to yourself to form, not just on Twitter, but you need to make new friends. Like you need a circle of people that you trust, um, people that you can share secrets with. Like, as an engineer, you could go around and go out for beers and just like talk about tech all night with your friends and your colleagues and people across town. As a manager, there's a lot of trust involved. You know things about people, but you can't survive if you have to keep all this stuff to yourself. So you need to be able to like hold other people's secrets and be able to share yours, because I don't think anyone becomes a good manager without people that this is how we learn. Like there are only really ways to learn new skills as a manager. The first is to f something up, to get it very wrong and suffer the consequences. And
Yeah.
the second and the second is through storytelling, hearing other people's stories, telling your stories to other people, processing them together, learning together like what to take away from a situation. And the more stories you could hear of someone else's and how they responded, like think through how you would have responded, like that's the only real way to get a leg up on just making a ton of mistakes. You need a set of friends. Where I thought you were going when you started that out was just like, personally, when I'm an engineer, I'm a social butterfly after hours. I'll go out for drinks, I'll see my friends,
Mm.
I'll do all these things. I also read a lot of fiction, and when I am managing people, I read no fiction. There's too much emotions. I can't handle with the emotional state of everyone in fictional stories. I only read nonfiction, and I go home and I stare at the wall after work. I do not interact with other people because I have a certain amount of emotional bandwidth, and either I am investing that at work or I'm investing that in my personal life, and I don't have enough for both.
That's an interesting take too. That's absolutely right, right? Like you have to figure out your energy is spent in a different spectrum than it was as an engineer, and that could have more profound effects.
I've known parents who go back and forth when their children are young, like they stop managing and they go back to engineering, and then when their kids grow up a little, then they go back to management. Which, one of the things that I think is interesting, that I hope is coming out of all of these sort of like sloshy changes that are in the air, is just I think that as an engineering manager, there comes a point after a few years where you need to decide whether you're going to go back to engineering or you're going to climb the ladder. Um, it's fine to climb the ladder to get farther away from the tech. We need good people to do that. But I don't really think it's a stable career to just be an engineering manager for like 10, 20, 30 years. Like it, you need a certain amount of credibility. You need a certain amount of being, grounded in the tech. And after 5, 6 years, you lose it, right? And you can still manage, but I think that deep down we know that we're less effective.
It's such an interesting thought, that idea that like, it's a role that is meant to be potentially, right? Transient. This idea that you come into it with your ideas and your goals and your initiatives, and like you said, you either have to go back into the field to glean more things, to be under more managers, to get more information, to
Yeah.
experience more and see more, and then re-enter it with a fresh perspective and a fresh idea, or continue that evolution down the path. It's sort of interesting idea that this role might be this kind of like way station to different outcomes.
I also think that, the opportunities to climb the ladder are rarer than people realize. There there aren't that many. It's hard to like line up your career, like unless you're like joining a Facebook or a Google or someplace that just has like a ladder all the time. The opportunities are
Yeah.
rare, and I feel like if I was advising someone, I would tell them to be opportunistic about it, to plan to be a manager, engineer, manager, staff, principal, whatever, but like to go back and forth and just to think of themselves as a technologist rather than as an engineer or a manager. But then
Mm,
opportunistically, like I think that if you become a strong technologist over the course of your career, and then if you're in the right place at the right time, where you get the opportunity to be a director or a VP or something, go for it. But when I see people like too bent on those, like the fact is that like you could be pretty happy as an engineer at a lot of places. Being a manager, you're much more sensitive to the quality of the organization, let's say.
yeah.
There are a lot of terrible places to be a manager. There are a lot of places that will just suck the life out of you. And if you're willing to do whatever it takes to be a director, that's often not a very happy path.
Yeah, I mean, if part of your role is to represent the organization, there
Yeah.
a very big part of whether you're going to be successful and happy is who you're carrying that water for,
Alignment.
who you're helping. Not just on the mission and what they're accomplishing in the world, but also just yeah, how they act and how
Yeah,
they treat their people, because that's gonna you're
completely.
gonna part of that system. Whether you want to
You
be or not, to be
represent it.
effective, you
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 are
have to be a part of it. Yeah.
it. Yeah, good leaders, no good leader will separate themselves and be like, "Well, the org says this and I don't." Like you can't do that, you know? We've all seen that particular pathology. Yeah, you really want to be at a place that you believe in if you're gonna climb the ladder. And every rung of the ladder that you go up, there are an order of magnitude fewer possible jobs. This is why it takes a CEO like sometimes a year or two or three to find their next new job, right? They're scarce, and you become very specific when you are in upper management at a company. The way engineering, skills more or less translate from company to company. The higher, and this actually applies to like architects too, and like principal engineers. Very often, the higher up you go, the more specific you get and the less of a generalist you are, which is, it is neither good nor bad. It just is. And it's something I think people don't really factor in.
Yeah, it is hard to help people understand the concept of like local maxima and be this
Yeah.
like, yes, you're a principal engineer, but you might need to take a step back to get out of this because you are in a very
Yeah.
specific niche with very few
Yeah.
opportunities at that level. So,
And feeling trapped in your career is something that is not good. As an engineer, yeah, like maximizing for optionality is, I think, the best strategy for almost everyone, especially the first half of your career, right? By which I mean the first 25 or 30 years.
well, wonderful. That's going to bring us to the end of our conversation here. I mean, certainly there's a lot more to say on this topic, but we'll let that maybe go out onto the internet. So, can you let people know where they can find you online if they want to hear more about what you have to think or interact with you?
Yeah, totally. Well, I work at honeycomb.io. We have a great technical blog, and sometimes we post management content there too. In fact, Emily Nakashima wrote this terrific pair of blog posts on becoming a VP of engineering that are like nothing I think I've ever read. There's also my blog at charity.wtf, and I am on Twitter at Nipsey Tipsy.
Well, wonderful. That's going to be it for us today. Thank you so much to Charity for being our guest today, and thank you to all of you for being here and listening. Hope to see you all next time. As we close out, we'd like to thank our sponsor, This.Labs, who'd like us to remind you that they are trusted by top names like Meta, Google, and T-Mobile. This.Labs helps bridge the gap from business requirements to tech implementation. Whether you're modernizing legacy systems, ensuring sustainable application architecture, or seeking expert guidance, This.Labs has the experience to help. Discover more at this.co. That's THISDOT.co. Thanks again to them for letting me do this, and thanks, Charity, for being here today. See you all next time.